few goods. Well, one way to help alleviate the upward pressure on prices is to have more goods. But if we're not producing more, then we're not going to get more. And if you look at manufacturing output, that was supposed to rise 0.2. Instead, it rose at just 0.1. And again, the prior month's number was revised from up 0.4 to up 0.2. These are very low numbers. And making it worse, look at the capacity utilization rate. It sank from 80.4 all the way down to 79.9. That is a very weak number, indicative of recession. And in fact, the prior month's number was revised from what was originally reported as 80.3 down to just 80.
Peter Schiff is an economist, financial broker/dealer, author, frequent guest on national news, and host of the Peter Schiff Show podcast. He laments on the negligence of the Fed in fighting inflation and how we could have been way better off than we were now if actual policies were been put in place. Interest rate hikes get most of the attention as the Federal Reserve fights inflation, but balance sheet reduction is arguably more important. And it's not going well. When the Fed started quantitative tightening, the artificial demand it created disappeared. As a result, bond prices tanked and interest rates spiked. This is not a good scenario for a U.S. government with more than $31 trillion in debt. If the Fed was serious about fighting inflation, it would not only let maturing bonds roll off its balance sheet, but it would also sell treasuries into the open market. This would shrink the Fed balance sheet and pull excess dollars out of the economy. But the central bankers know they can't do that without collapsing the treasury market. According to Peter, we are in what could be called a stealth recession, as the Fed is putting a cover over the actual recession announcement with an excuse of a positive GDP in the third quarter, which was caused by unprecedented factors and very temporary ones at that. Let's get into the video and expand more on that. Remember to like the video, subscribe, and drop your comments below.
We continue to get more economic data that confirms that the economy is in fact in recession. It's actually a stealth recession because nobody wants to acknowledge that it's actually here. And of course, we did get positive GDP growth in the third quarter. So that's also throwing everybody off. Remember, when we did have 2 negative quarters of GDP, they still denied that we were in a recession. So now that they got a positive quarter, it makes the denial even more plausible. But again, when you look into the reasons for the positive number, it's all temporary. It's all the result of exporting oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which I think is now at the lowest since 1982 and continues to be drained. By sometime next year, it will be completely empty. There will be no more strategic oil left in that petroleum reserve. And that means that oil prices will be set to explode higher, and there'll be nothing we could do about it. Just imagine if we actually got a legitimate shortage, if something actually happened where we would have normally liked to have utilized those reserves in a legitimate emergency instead of the political emergency that Biden faced. And in fact, had we not sold all that oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, maybe the Democrats wouldn't have done as well in the midterm elections, because people would have been a lot more pissed off about inflation when they were driving to the polls with even more expensive gasoline than what they ended up paying. But the other factor that contributed to gaining GDP in the third quarter, in fact, the only factor, because if you X that out, GDP contracted yet again, was that the trade deficit was much lower than expected, partially because of the export of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but also because of the strength of the dollar that made our imports less expensive and so shrank the trade deficit. That dollar strength is already reversing, and by next year, it will start subtracting even bigger numbers from an already weakening GDP. Plus, as usually is the case, the inflation number that they used to deflate the GDP in Q3, the GDP deflator, was actually much lower than what I believe the actual rate of inflation was, or the increase in consumer prices during that quarter. So that is exaggerating the economic growth, because if you can make believe that inflation is lower, then you simultaneously get to pretend that GDP growth is higher. And that's another reason that the government has to lie about inflation, because not only do they fool the public into thinking that inflation isn't as bad as it is, but at the same time, they get a twofer, because that also means they get to lie to the public about how strong the economy is, because they get to show a stronger GDP number than what they would show if they had an honest inflation number. But looking at the data that came out over the last few days, yesterday, we got the Kansas City Fed Manufacturing Index, and in the month of October, it was -7, and in the month of November, it came out at -6. Sure, slightly higher than the -7, but still a negative number. That indicates contraction. Also, today, we got the industrial production numbers for October, and there we were supposed to be up 0.2. Instead, we dropped 0.1. And adding insult to injury, we downwardly revised the prior month's number, which was originally reported at up 0.4. That was up just 0.1. So you're flat now over 2 consecutive months for industrial production. And again, why this is bad is because if you're trying to fight inflation, one way to make the job easier is to increase the supply of goods. Because remember, prices go up because you have too much money, 0.1. But an even worse number that we got today was the Philadelphia Fed Manufacturing Index. That was supposed to come out at -7, which would have been a slight improvement over the -8.7 from the prior month. But any negative number is consistent with recession. You want a positive number if you want a growing economy. And so we got a negative number, but the number that we actually got for November was -19.4. This was below even the lowest estimate on the street, because the consensus range went from -15 to -5. So nobody thought this number would come out positive, but nobody thought it would be this negative, because the economy continues to surprise people by being weaker than everybody expects. But still, you have back-to-back negative numbers. All these numbers would be positive if the economy was in fact growing, but the fact that all these manufacturing numbers are coming out negative indicates that it's contracting. And again, this is complicating the Fed's inflation fight.
The U.S. trade deficit in goods widened sharply in September, likely as a strong dollar and softening global demand weighed on exports, but that did not change expectations that trade led to an anticipated rebound in economic growth in the third quarter. The report from the Commerce Department also showed moderate increases in wholesale and retail inventories last month, suggesting slowing domestic demand was forcing businesses to become more cautious about ordering more goods. The Federal Reserve is aggressively hiking interest rates to tame inflation, boosting the dollar and curbing spending. The goods trade deficit increased 5.7% to $92.2 billion last month. September's increase reversed only a portion of the prior month's declines, leaving the goods trade deficit considerably lower in the third quarter. While the trade deficit looks to have narrowed substantially in the third quarter, we think that the stronger dollar will help push the deficit wider over time. All market signals point to a very big recession already in place, but the Fed insists on sugarcoating and hiding that fact to not take full responsibility, and this is where Peter beseech Americans to see beyond the facade and understand that there is a real problem here, and if you don't save yourself now, you will be caught up in the spiraling tornado when it fully hits. Are you prepared to make sacrifices for your future? Let us know what you think in the comment section. Do like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.